We're in the final stretch. We've got a couple of panel discussions this afternoon, and hopefully we'll see some of you guys at the gala tonight as well. There are tickets available if you still want to go. But rather than wait any longer, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce Kathryn. I don't have background information, so you get to introduce yourself. All right. Thanks, everyone. Oh, they'll need it. Okay. Which number is it?
1.
I'll give you this one. We know this one works. Okay.
All right. Hope you all enjoyed your coffee break. I'm going to kick off our RIS OSVP session here this afternoon. Before we get started, let me go ahead and bring up our panelists on the stage. We have 2 representatives of our working groups. We have the color management working group and then the camera tracking working group. We're going to start off with the color management group today, so I'm going to welcome onto the stage our other panelists, David Long, Kathryn Brillhart, and Jim Geduldick. So if you all want to join me up here. All right, so as I was just introducing, so we are representatives of the color management working group as a part of the interoperability work stream as a part of the RIS initiative. So RIS, for those of you who aren't aware, is an initiative that SMPTE spawned a few years ago in response to the increasing use of virtual production and the rapid availability of all that technology. And so we recognized a need for industry professionals to come together to make sure that all of these new tools, new systems, new ecosystems all were able to work well with each other, and that there was education to support all of this new technology coming into the industry. If you are interested in learning more, or you're someone who wants to be a part of this initiative, please reach out to RIS OSVP info at SMPTE.org. We're always looking for industry professionals to join in and help make sure that we're making this technology understood, accessible, and just helping to make sure that we can promote the creative industry to continue doing what they do best. So jumping into the color management side of things, our working group started spawning off around this time last year is where we really kicked off our initiatives. So we presented at last year's MTS to describe our big major goals. We started with just trying to define the problems, what it is that we wanted to achieve. And where we got to last year was starting to highlight and identify color conversions that are happening in color workflows for on-set virtual production. And where we're starting to look towards next was assigning or prescribing some best practices for those conversions. If you are someone who has worked with any of these tools in the industry right now, everyone has their own flavor of doing these things. Maybe they have their own terminologies. And we recognized one of the things we could help with in interoperability is unifying that and making sure that we all had a similar understanding of what it is we were trying to achieve. But, with that, we were asking ourselves last year, exactly what kind of deliverables are we wanting to produce as a part of our working group? There's many different avenues that could go down, and we were trying to find a good source of inspiration. Something that, we were introducing last year is that this really is a iceberg analogy for what we're trying to describe in color management. So at a surface level, we're seeing things as a color problem, but especially in this infrastructure, there's so many other sub-problems that are there, whether it's how we're lighting things on set in combination with how cameras are perceiving both light coming from an LED wall and those lights on set. New ways that a color management workflow is being introduced, not just at a later stage in post-production, but how that's all happening much earlier in the production process. So there's lots of avenues we can go down, and it was important for us to try to prioritize how we go about that and how we can present that information well to the industry. So what we've been working on the past year is starting from a baseline foundation, which we're going to dive into today, which is all about setting up a good foundation of some of these color engineering principles. So coming soon, hopefully in the beginning of 2025, we have a publication that'll be entitled Color Management Principles for LED Panels in On-Set Virtual Production. With the idea that that's going to take us through some of these basic foundations for color workflows, specifically how they relate to LED panels. Something that we've talked about many times for us here up on the stage is acknowledging that LED panels aren't the only component here, and that there's other parts in on-set virtual production that have color management that have nothing to do with LED panels, but in particular, this is the one that we're starting with. So throughout the rest of next year, we expect to have more publications that are diving deeper into subtopics that build upon this foundation in the first article. So specific things like calibration techniques, image-based lighting, validation methodologies, things that we've heard from professionals in the industry and those of us who are with us on the working group of what they're looking for information that we can provide. So today you're going to get a glimpse into some of that material that will be coming out next year. We're going to, as we pass down through the panel, we'll go through some of these color management principles and then get a little more into how these things are being applied in practice and what are the technology foundations there. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on down through our panelists. We're going to go through a series of lightning talks for each of our respective fields. And yeah, we'll go ahead and get started there. So I'll pass it over to David.
Thanks, Kathryn. So I'm going to do a bit of a quick review. If you visited on Monday morning and saw the primer that I delivered on virtual production and its challenges, color was a subsection of that. Here's a chance to get a little bit deeper. And in particular, I'm going to set the stage. Our other panelists are going to speak to some applied solutions and the ways in production that some of these situations are being dealt with now. But my goal is to convey to you the complexities of some different workflows and color management responsibilities of the entire workflow team. And I'm going to start with a very, very simple one. The simple concept that if you are an artist generating a synthetic element, a virtual element, whether that be environment or characters that are meant to be displayed on an LED panel and captured by the camera, at the end of the day, color management is extremely important in live cinematography and the insertion of that footage into post. It should thus be just as important to pre-produce properly and have that content color managed before it even gets sent to an LED panel. And then you also have to think about, as Kathryn alluded, all of the different components that do touch and change color, have color knobs and responsibilities. And so this is just an exemplar of a scenario on a virtual production volume where the director of photography is intending to, through the confidence monitor of the camera, affirm that the content that VAD produced is delivering the look that was intended. And we can diagram this out specifically, chatting about the different color science principles and color physics principles that are at play, and the complexities there, and also the places where it can kind of fall apart. So, of course, color management for virtual production has three major components. It is the VAD team's responsibility to author. It is the volume's responsibility to convey and relay that radiometry and that colorimetry appropriately. And then the camera is ultimately responsible for capturing that scene off of the volume. And we'll talk in just a second about when it's a hybrid environment, when you've got foreground talents and color assets as well as the VAD assets. But for now, just consider the complexity of this very simple workflow, this full round trip where VAD is generating content and the camera needs to eventually capture it. One of our co-authors for the article Kathryn mentioned in January, Rod Bogart from Epic, likes to use the term match. It just is supposed to match. It's supposed to be easy at the end, but there's a series of complex transforms that come into play. So if you're the VAD team, for example, if I come to you as a color physicist, color scientist and say, hey, you're supposed to create a reproduction of real light matter interaction, it's supposed to look right. The problem is that we're a creative industry, and you're probably not generating those VAD environments through the bland real-world analog. You're probably previewing them through a show LUT. And so you're making decisions on VAD color and color authorship through a show LUT. So if we look at this diagram here on the far left, we start with the linear render of the CG elements. Now, linear rendering is a physics process. It's a simulation of light-matter interaction. It's been very well established through both non-real-time and real-time rendering engines through the years. But the idea is that as a VAD artist, you have to understand you are authoring to a fundamentally physically linear space, which is what the rendering curve, the straight line curve on the left infers, but you also have to pick your rendering volume. You have to select your primaries. And the selection of the primaries there is going to have implicit impact all the way down the chain. If you select VAD primaries that are larger than subsequent systems can produce, you're going to have gamut mapping, you're going to have clipping, you're not necessarily going to get that match you want from beginning to end. So you have to be careful and consider that. You also, again, have to have your showlet ready to go in pre-production, so you are giving that VAD team the best opportunity to pre-visualize not the root physics of that synthetic scene, but how it's supposed to render with the aesthetic intent on top. You've got to prepare that footage to send over to the wall, and we are still communicating between our VAD nodes and our LED processors and the LED architectures via bit-limited transport layer. So you're not going to be sending that linear light down that transport layer. You've got to do a quantization, protection, inverse EOTF curve. And unlike most people in broadcast who come to read and understand something like the Rec. 709 OETF curve, it's not even called inverse EOTF because it is not the inverse of the 1886 display curve for SDR end-to-end broadcast workflow. The two of them concatenate to a net non-linear scene-to-screen tone reproduction because we have to accommodate visual phenomena in human beings. When we look at that broadcast content, we don't want the real physics on the screen. We're not in the same spaces as the scene, and so our adaptation in the human visual system demands that we actually boost the contrast a little bit. You can't do that if you're sending content to a wall. The wall is supposed to be a replicate of physics. So you have to be very, very cautious about preparing that inverse EOTF literally as an inverse EOTF to go out of the rendering engine and down the pathway into the LED processor. And then you hope that the LED processor is aware of the color encoding volume. The color primaries here, I've just done exemplary Rec. 709. Seems to be a default that some people use. Clearly, if you get into higher end visual effects where people know their color and have color scientists, you play with bigger spaces, you try to not restrict yourself. But for today's representation, it's a common language I think we can all understand. The color processor, the LED processor, is responsible for acknowledging that no LED emitter is a Rec. 709 color set. The primaries are not the same. And so, of course, you've got to relinearize that signal that the game engine sent you, and you've got to be able to turn your primaries from Rec. 709 encoding into the actual drive for the processor. Those of you who've noted I've skipped this thing called M, don't worry, I'm coming back to it in just a second, but we got to go through like everything's perfect and then realize when it's not, we have to do calibration matrices as example. Once you've transformed the primary drive into the native for the display, that has to be re-encoded. That has to be run again through the inverse EOTF because you do not want to send linear values down a bit-limited transport layer. So you're going to protect from quantization, and you're going to hope that when you send that signal to the LED hardware, that it somehow is performing to the obligated EOTF, and it is somehow performing to a calibrated state with its emission primaries, and all that LED processor transform from the VAD space to the native LED space has been done properly, so that eventually you take a picture with a camera. And again, now if your camera is encoded linear, if you use one of the raw formats and can interpret that, and the camera is tuned to an encoding space that matches VAD, that out of that preview monitor on set, the DP, the director, everyone who cares about this can put that show LUT on, and they can say, yes, it matches. Now, there's a ton of places where this match may not happen, right? There's a ton of things that are going to perhaps cause it to fall apart. And so we do have calibration matrices and other transforms that we suggest putting into the pipeline. The simplest one represented here is that calibration matrix you can stick all the way back in engine, and you can use platforms like OpenColor.io, or there are other proprietary solutions to put those things in. But they are attempting with some simple linear algebra to correct where some of this stuff can fall apart. And the concern is when it's not a linear physics problem that is falling apart, the matrix is going to be insufficient. So it's a space really rich for some innovation and accommodation of improvements and monitoring of the actual places where linearity can fall apart. You may not have an engine that is applying the exact inverse EOTF of the LED panels. So you may have an accumulated nonlinearity. You can't fix that with the 3x3 matrix. you may have gamut mapping implications. Again, if you start in bad in a big giant color volume and you progressively go to smaller ones, at some point you have to clip or you have to gamut map. That's inherently a nonlinear process. You're not going to be able to assure that match through show LUT and monitoring on set. And then everyone believes that cameras are colorimeters, and they are not. Cameras are not colorimeters. They have preferred rendering. There are matrices in them that go from their non-color matching function response to some emulation thereof. There are even advanced techniques. Area's come out in their latest line with some interesting alternative to matrix techniques to be a little more accurate, but they're not accurate colorimeters. And so if you believe you are capturing in 709 with your camera, and hey, as long as it's the 709 colorimetry, I have a colorimeter, I pointed it at it, I got the right numbers, my camera should see it the same, right? It's not necessarily going to. That is also a spot where nonlinearity can creep in. And so simple matrix can get you statistically there, but it's not going to fix it all, right? This is the easy problem of all the problems. The other problems are what happens when the camera needs to look at a real object and a bad object that are supposed to be consistent across a seam, and there is no difference. There is a perfect metameric match. We just said that the cameras themselves are not adequate colorimeters. Well, this is going to cause us some observer metamerism, as it's called. The camera's response functions are going to look at the spectral emission of the LED set. They're going to look at a compared real-world element, and they're going to see some offset that's not necessarily appropriate. So seams might become visible. This is different from just having the camera match bad. Now you've got to have your real-world art in the foreground and the bad replicate of it in the background look the same through the camera. The other things we want to think about are the popularity of using the LED volumes as principal lighting. Really, really dangerous thing to do because, again, the spectra of the emitters on your typical LED panels are very narrow band. And that's a classic problem with illuminant metamerism. So at RIT, we ran a very quick test to showcase this. We illuminated my research assistant, Aiden, with holding the Macbeth chart with our LED volume. And then we had an Aries Sky panel we brought in, and we color balanced the neutral scale and the exposure straight through a traditional cinema camera capture. And you can see that there's a huge saturation skin tone implication. So if you're a DP that cares about controlling this stuff on set, you should absolutely be wary of mixing the LEDs as illuminant and the principal lighting that you've got on set as illuminant. So lots of problems, right? Lots of things that we're addressing. The article is going to start speaking about these in a little more detail, and then the series of articles to follow are going to address some of the root theory and root mathematics, and eventually starts to introduce some of the solutions that are starting to appear, and that's where I'll transition to my panelists. I think, Jim, you're next, right?
Thanks. That was a lot. But I guess the good thing of what we've been working on as a whole for color and the larger group for Rapid Imaging Solutions Group is we're here to give you hope. There are solutions out there. It just takes practice, and it does take, I say, much of this is all about communication between different departments. Those are at the vendors, those are at your on-stage teams, those are at your R&D teams, your color scientists, if you're lucky enough to have them at your company or at a vendor you're working with. But in this example, this is a traditional ACES CG compositing workflow through Nuke. And kind of talking about the color management that David was talking about, where a lot of the authoring that's happening for virtual production and in-camera visual effects is happening with the virtual art department. It could be, it could be even earlier, in previs and layout, and that could come from a lot of different sources. You can have multiple different vendors authoring different content with different color pipelines. This is where it gets messy, as David, talked about before, is even though there may be standards to follow within OCIO, ACES-CG, OTIL, and across the industry as a whole, it may not be implemented at any one vendor, any one stage, one-to-one across the board. And that's where we run into issues. So having color managed pipelines are extremely important as early as possible, all the way through your projects, whether it be film, TV, games, experiential, location-based entertainment, live broadcast. It's extremely important. And just because we're at SMPTE, I knew I had to put in some nice flow charts and schematics. So this is one of my workflows for a recent TV show that I supervised. And this was a multi-camera show that was an HDR delivery. So from the get-go with a virtual art department, we had to look at both a 709 and a 2020 monitoring workflow on set, and knowing that our final delivery to visual effects and to post-production was making sure that on set we were compliant through to deliver for Apple for an HDR delivery. So this is kind of stepping through what myself and our DIT Bradley had come through of at this time an ASIS 1.0 workflow, and knowing that our virtual art department was going to have to be working outside. So none of the VAD team that we had was on set for this component. So a lot of the handover of assets to stage optimization for color management pipeline had to be very stringent in our delivery for a vendor like Apple. So making sure that our artists, as early on with concepting, layout, and previs, we're working with calibrated monitors. We're working in other DCCs that had the implementation of our color management pipeline. So it made it much easier to flow through as the assets were being authored, optimized on stage. We're calibrating on stage, which was across the globe, and using things. So on this particular show, we used Netflix's OpenVPCal for our calibration. For those of you who don't know, there are a lot of handy tools for color calibration for LED volumes and in-camera visual effects. Stepping through, as David mentioned earlier, there are a lot of different tools that are used within LED volumes. As we said before, virtual production is not just LED volumes. You have things like Simulcam. You have different use cases of virtual production tools through image-based lighting and Final Pixel. Just like there are many cameras and lights and panels and processors to choose, there are also different engines and media servers that get mixed into the game. By default, most of us are very familiar that, Epic and Unreal has been kind of the champion and one of the most progressive in virtual production today. Within those tool sets, going back, as early as, pre even Unreal Engine 4, looking at taking a game engine and shoehorning it into a production tool. At the end of the day, Unreal Engine 5 today is a game engine. Its specific purpose is to make games. All of us in production, no matter what facility of production we're in, have shoehorned it into a production tool. And the team at Epic and everybody involved giving feedback in both ways has transitioned this tool to be a very compliant and beneficial tool for us, especially when it comes to color managed workflows. As David said, our good friend and fellow colleague, Rod Bogart, from Epic, along with the entire team, the virtual production team, with Kim Labiri and Ryan Maeda and Alejandro and everybody else in Miles at Epic, have been implementing tools for color management workflows every iteration. So just not on the software side for color management, we have a lot of hardware in here in terms of being compliant. This is just an example of some what are termed as LUT boxes, or so there are different links within a color management chain in terms of hardware and software that signal flow has to step through and how pixels are displayed. There's a lot of different ways. It's also very confusing to newcomers. Seasoned veterans, whether they be ASC, DPs, lighting designers, what have you from traditional production world, are not as familiar with some of the workflows that we've been doing in real time and visual effects and virtual production. So it's daunting at times as a supervisor and a cinematographer to educate people as to why color management is extremely important throughout a pipeline and the different nuances a choice makes within, as early as you are deciding, how the pixels are being authored to how they're being displayed and captured and then delivered is extremely important. And that's why, we're all here championing color management workflows and trying to get this education out here, because there's still today a lot of confusion and education that still needs to happen into proper color managed workflows for virtual production. So again, another ACES flowchart. Some tools, as mentioned, OpenVPCal from the team at Netflix, and looking at available tools that are either open sourced. There are some behind paywalls. There are some that are being developed and put out there from a lot of the processor manufacturers, camera manufacturers, and color software manufacturers. So OpenVPCal is a great one. It's available to look at it. There's great documentation from the Netflix team on there. We have Sony's tools with Sony's color calibration, really great, especially if you're working in a Sony ecosystem with the Verona panels, Venice 2. Hats off to the Sony team who did a really great job of putting tools out there for us, specifically working with Unreal Engine to make the calibration of color between engine, panel, and camera much easier. Hopefully this plays. And this is just a little step through the Sony color calibration tool. It's just looking at 3 years ago for doing color calibration from engine, from media server to volume or to IBL workflow or to simulcam. It feels like we have leapfrogged in terms of things becoming much easier, but still gaps that are needed to fill. And this happens to be stepping through between OpenVPCal from Netflix team, Sony team. Ari as well has their color calibration tool with their series of cameras, as well as David mentioned too, physical lighting, cinema lights as well. There are routes and ways to use calibration to calibrate your cinema lights as well as your LED panels. And this is more of our calibration tool. And before I hand it off to Kathryn, one of the really big things in terms of like the practical applications of how we're using this, between cinematographers, supervisors, and the communication chain that needs to happen as early as possible for color management between all the different departments on a given production is to make sure that color is talked about early. It has detrimental effects on your projects, and that's why talking about this as early as concept, look dev, layout, previs, tech viz, before it even hits, virtual art department team, usually what will happen is production side soup will work with the post supervisor, will work with the DP and the camera team, and all the other department heads to look at, what is the delivery? Where were we displaying and delivering these pixels to? And this will help inform early on in the color management chain of where we're setting things up, how we're calibrating our cameras, because this, virtual production is very much a dance between the other departments, especially camera department and our lighting team. So it's extremely important that, as soon as your team members come on board, the conversations of color management are discussed as early as possible. And I think that's my lightning, and I'll hand it off to Kathryn to pick up.
Awesome. Yeah, this is great. You guys went into very deep depths. So the exciting thing about the group of all of us is that we all come from different backgrounds. We have, like deep science and math. We've got practitioners. We have some producers. And so something that I'm really excited about is that we're aiming to write these articles in a way that speaks to a couple different audiences, because to Jim's point about how early on this is important. We are still educating producers who are hiring us on a project, and who's hired first, plays a role into maybe who's influencing color management. So yeah, it's kind of this big wild west at the moment. My slides, I just kind of pulled from from Black Adam, because it's an interesting project in that we shot it in 2021 before OpenVPCal, before the virtual production glossary, before the virtual production handbook. So I can speak from experience as somebody who's had to figure this out on the job. In some cases, it can be really complicated, but it's just so, these slides really just represent, kind of maybe a high view of the type of information that we want accessible to people that David and Jim kind of already mentioned. So in this case study, we determined the DCIP3, color gamut. We knew that we wanted to map the luminance values to PQ 10,000, and that we were going to start at a native 6500D. And in our article, for example, we'd want to be able to kind of start with a cinematic example like that, let's say, and then provide math to back that up. So here are the artistic reasons why you're mapping your scene luminance is important. For example, if you decide to map to a higher dynamic range, you have more space in your highlights for explosions, and as Jim and David said, more visual effects work or bright scenes. And then, we want to help connect the math to the practical examples, basically. Because honestly, when it comes to open source and being able to do this on your own, you shouldn't have to pay for software. It really is just math and a little bit of science. And once you kind of get your head wrapped around a framework for doing this, whether you have to apply it to cinema, simulcam, broadcast, some of these different applications, then you can just kind of take your playbook and modify it. And so I think one of our, goals with this is to kind of not really set a standard, because they're always going to change on some level, but create a framework to start with, or best practices, so that when practitioners like Jim and I, are in that development phase with production and us can be on the same ground about how many test days do we need to set this up? Is it really complicated? How precise does the color matching need to be? All that. So these slides just represent more of some of these steps. So for example, we take you through calibration and profiling, what that means in more detail. These are just, top level points. Maybe some of the measurement tools that you need. We want to talk about test patterns, how to create those, how those correlate with the workflow charts that Jim shared, for example. But we're hoping, just the visuals that you're seeing in this presentation from us, a publication that really incorporates, from a visual and informational standpoint, all of these different angles, so lots of people can look at this and understand the science and the creative. And so Article 2 specifically that we're sort of jamming out now on is tying in the basics and the foundations that David set up for us, and then talking about calibrating the camera sensor, not necessarily using it as a colorimeter, how you could use it, and then where its limitations are. And we also kind of want to point out as well, what happens if you don't do these steps. And I just threw this slide in to kind of give you a visual. So you could be QCing content, as Jim said, from tons of different vendors. And if you get the incorrect image that's on the slide, what is your checklist to identify at what point in the ecosystem you've got an error? Because it could be them delivering the content incorrectly. What's your checklist to make sure you're good there? It could be a setting in the wall because you're commissioning a new wall. You might not run into this issue at some of the newer stages that are out there. But if you're somebody like Jim and I that maybe is partnering with the stage, if we're not the in-house VP supervisor and we've got to diagnose an issue very quickly, us having our a framework or a checklist to go through to help solve the issue quickly is important. So we want to share that knowledge with everyone. So yeah, that's just a summary of what we're up to.
All right. So as a wrap up for the color management portion, I'll again give a call to action. If you are a individual, a vendor, a creative, someone who has opinions, expertise, thoughts that they want to contribute to our working group, this is the place to reach out to. At this point, I think we have time for just a couple questions before we head over to the rest of our session.
Hiya. Thank you. Great presentation. I just wanted to ask, as someone who's maybe newer to the industry, what are some tools or some skills that would be good to acquire to sort of get involved in all things virtual production and all the color side of it and basically all the research that you guys are doing? If you could give some pointers about whether there's fields of study to maybe get my hands into or stuff like that, that would be really good. Useful.
That's funny. We have an educator on this panel.
I got to go back to college? No. I think that as RIS OSVP, one of the things we aspire to do is to deliver some of that knowledge in a digestible way. Also acknowledge, too, decide where in the workflow you want to be, right? Jim and I could never do each other's jobs. I don't want to try to figure out how to harness all those fabulous tools, but I love talking about how they should work.
I don't want to do his math.
Yeah,
either.
exactly. So we're great partnership, right? So I think it's about finding what intrigues you. Some of those topics to get trained up, to get skillful enough, you do have to go pretty far back into physics, color science to be able to understand. But there's so much that's accessible too if you're trying to figure out the applied skill set, the engineering, the problem solving skill set. And like so many things in our industry, right, if you can harness breaking a problem down into its constituent parts, finding help if you are not that skillful person to solve it, and put a team together. Be inspired to learn a little bit more about stuff that you may not understand.
Yeah, and there's a lot of resources out there. I know YouTube is a great source. It's also a little bit of a rat trap in terms of information that may or may not be what you're looking for. But out of a lot of the vendors outside of what we're doing here at RIS, which a lot of the key vendors are involved in SMPTE and in Rapid Imaging Solutions Group, the whole thing of RIS is to try to get these information and education gaps filled by doing these articles, by looking at the protocols that we are, because as practitioners and people all involved in this movement, which is virtual production, is we see the gaps. Like we all see the gaps being on set or teaching the next generation coming out of the schools or from the vendor side, hearing feedback from who is using the different tools. So there's a lot of resources. If you picked any one engine, any one camera, any one panel, I'm sure you'll find that there's an education track, be it on their YouTube, on their support page, white papers, any of that. There's quite a bit of information out there, especially around color management for virtual production.
Cool. And I'll just add that the awesome thing about it is like it's a blend of the virtual and physical world. So any physical skill set that you would learn in regular live action filmmaking, let's say, it applies to virtual production, but you might need to upskill in like Python or building your own tools so that you're more useful to the team because you'll be working in a different team environment. Same kind of goes the other way. You could be an engineering person from Microsoft and be like, I love filmmaking, and then be like a tool builder that also just needs to gain maybe more background in art direction or, whatever artistic skill they want. And you kind of like work toward the other half of that goal, if that makes sense. Same with like a visual effects artist. They might need to learn about physics of lighting and like maybe go out and have more exposure to on-set capture to be a better CG lighter. But it's just kind of that fun progression of like, it could be self-taught, like Jim said, or through school.
Have any more questions?
Thanks. Hey guys, I'm with Leica Geosystems. Actually, Jim, we spoke earlier. Hi. Just a quick question. Mostly what we focus on is the LiDAR capture, so actual geometry. But our sensors also have cameras with HDR capabilities, and so a lot of that's used to capture color data that we can then send down the pipe to any visual effects artists who are recreating that space. It's especially important if you're recreating, let's say, a real world environment that's well known, like a Times Square or something, or if you're trying to match that extensions, on the day with whatever practical elements you have in your volume. I mean, obviously, anyone on set's not going to be referencing our raw data. They're going to be referencing whatever's been produced by the visual effects artist. But I'm just wondering, are there any ways that as we're capturing that color data during a scan that we can sort of optimize the way that artists down the pipe are going to use it and how it's going to ultimately be referenced on set? I'm just always curious about ways that we can sort of improve that process.
100%. Okay. Capturing any and all data, metadata, is extremely important. I'm a metadata geek. I will take all of your data, all of everybody's data, just so we have it, because you never know along a pipeline where that data is going to be beneficial to someone. And especially from like site scan with LiDAR, when we get to a future stage of like having more RGB with depth-based capture solutions that are more accessible, is going to be beneficial to everybody, because when I go out and I do a site scan and I'm capturing reference data, usually what we're doing is we're doing LiDAR passes, we're doing HDRI passes, and we're collecting all this data. So that's usually, done by visual effects supervisor, data wrangling team, or a vendor that is doing it on behalf of the visual effects team, right, or construction team, or art director and layout. So yes, that's it. There are benefits to the workflow of being able to get color and depth information with geo all the way down the pipeline. So if there are capture systems that you guys are developing in the future, yes, that color information on top of the depth data and geometry can be used for us in virtual production, because we get into this big talk of looking at volumetric capture and what that means, going from 160 cameras down to one camera that can capture all color, depth, and light data, among other things. That's really beneficial to all of us in any kind of production that would use that advanced technology. It just happens to be more so visual effects is where we really need that, because we're making digital twins, we're making one-to-ones, or we're having to recreate things after the fact.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
And I just want to throw into that too. So related, Jim and the productions he works on are fabulously invested in doing things the right way and working with other partners to do things the right way. For the whole room, consider too going out and evangelizing for not doing things the wrong way. I've been on too many low budget indie or student sets where someone goes out and shoots a video plate and they say, oh, well, this is a big TV, right? You're going to have sRGB mode on your wall, so I should shoot in 709. And they forget that 709 is not the inverse tone transfer of the sRGB decode. And so all of a sudden they look through the lens and like, why is the contrast of my backplate not match my foreground? Well, it's because you've just taken a picture of a broadcast TV, which has a net boost. So simple things like understand linearizing your data. If you're going to do plates, live action plates, sometimes you got to unbuild that, right? The CG world and the CG tools can kind of give you the click box, but you got to remember to do it on the cameras too.
Yeah. If you can capture raw on your cameras, please do that. And that way you're not baking yourself into losing some headroom in terms of fidelity and color and lighting, because there are going to be other people that want to manipulate those pixels in a different way. So yes, if production allows it or your production allows it, please capture in RAW. Just buy more hard drives.
All right. I think we can take this one last question up here, and then that'll be it for us.
How you doing? Shane Ruggieri of Dolby Laboratories. Would you talk a little bit about like when you're shooting multicam and you need to keep the cameras calibrated in a way that sometimes there's a little bit of shift? What are some of the approaches that you guys take to do that?
Specifically on ICVFX or, traditional LED volume work is we have different tools at times. We'll work with the camera team, and DIT to look at that. Because things move so fast, it's different of like how you would shade cameras for a live broadcast versus how we're doing it on feature film or TV. Because of the fast-paced movement, you don't always get that time to be like, hey guys, C camera is getting a little bit magenta. What do we do there? There are tools in there that we don't want to be live grading the whole time, because then you just get into pixel peeping and tweaking things overly too much, and you'll just piss off a DP, really bad. But there are tools in there that you can individually, both the camera manufacturers and some intermediary tools in there, things like Live Grade Studio from Palm 4. You have tools in there that you can get the incoming, downstream or upstream signal and be able to manipulate that. So virtual production team, DIT, maybe you have the luck of having a colorist on set who might be looking at things with a DP if you're so fortunate, and being able to do that. But main point is, if you don't know how to look and judge scopes, learn. I know somebody asked before, learn about scopes, learn about RGB parade, learn about white point. It is extremely beneficial to understand, mathematically what is going on and to be able to judge things off that. So if you're on a virtual production set, mixed reality for broadcast, whatever it is, that virtual production team, that DIT, that colorist, or that camera team, it is, you can flip over to your scopes and look where you are. Is your white point correct? Are you in uniform in multi-camera? And we had that, on the last project with Yo Gabba Gabba is we were multicam. We had 4 cameras, 3 live all the time, multiple frustrums. Cameras can shift over time for ambient temperature. There is technology going on there that you can have these things of no fault of your own go out of phase. So it's kind of a good practice to just be in who is responsible for blending, and who is responsible for shading cameras, and who is responsible for looking at that. Traditional set, that might fall to DIT, but DIT also has to, work with virtual production supervisor and visual effects production supervisor and the other departments. So it's just an early conversation to look at, like, hey, if you're on a multi-camera shoot, who's responsible for shading cameras? Who's responsible for, keeping track of that? And usually, with good communication, you can kind of pinpoint, hey, I can always go to this person. I can say, oh, well, Kathryn's going to be responsible for that with, her team. Hey, where are we at? Camera C is shifting magenta, camera B is going here. Or do you just make time, either right before you come back from lunch or early in the morning when you're looking at, right before roll or going live, how it does. And I know it's always a time thing. It's always a time and a budget thing. That was a long-winded question and answer. Sorry.
Yeah, I second Jim. And I can just say from doing multi-camera with film cameras, to his point, the responsibility shifted into different roles. In block 1 of Fallout, it was between myself and the DIT, and then the post supervisor. And then in block 2, because I had set up the workflow to have a live grade component, both on the digital reference camera and on the wall itself, they kind of moved, we ended up picking up a new player on a team, which is a volume DP. So the volume DP and the DIT used that live grade on the wall to neutralize it even further, to anticipate film cameras. But from a film camera standpoint, in post, once that was chemically processed, they were dealing with most of that in post. So just kind of echoing Jim's point, like, it really depends on like what the setup is. And that was a crazy workflow.
Totally different workflow from all our other digital things.
Yeah. Yes, that was chemical and digital and fascinating.
No. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, if you have more questions, we'll be around.